Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I can make a promise to you this time that I will finish this opening statement this afternoon, barring any unforeseen calamities. We'll be finished this afternoon with the opening statement. Thank you for your patience, and I ask you again to keep an open mind. Just before we concluded lunch, we were talking about the importance of DNA, and we still have some more DNA to talk about. I have two charts now I want to discuss with you briefly. They're labeled, for the record, PCR amplification charts, and we're seeking to explain how this concept works, the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, this technology I've been talking to you about as a facet of DNA, of technology. PCR tests take these very, very small samples that we've been talking about, and now you've seen some of which you cannot even see, and they are amplified up, kind of a molecular Xeroxing, if you will. And that's what we're trying to demonstrate here. We expect the evidence to show and that scientists are not yet able to actually examine the small amount of DNA contained in minute specks of blood. They must first amplify the DNA so there's enough of it to examine. Amplification, or amplifying DNA, as I said, is like molecular Xeroxing. They start with a small amount of DNA, and they go through these various cycles. Each cycle doubles the amount of DNA, and they do this 32 times, the evidence will be, before they have enough DNA to examine. Now, this first chart shows what happens when you have a single piece of DNA that is then amplified or doubled 32 times. And then it goes from this one fragment that you may not have been able to even see to over 4 billion fragments, as is indicated on the particular chart. That is the molecular Xeroxing, made as, hopefully, as clear as we can make it, in line with what we expect the testimony to be. Mr. Douglas, we moved. What's the number of that chart, Mr. Douglas? Now, referring and directing your attention to number 209, which is the amplification of 4 fragments. Now, this chart seeks to illustrate for you what happens when there may be a mixture of DNA in the sample. Heard us talking about mixtures, and heard me this morning talk about the wipe test with a handkerchief on this particular podium. This chart shows 4 different fragments of DNA at the start. And after this mixture, just like we did in the previous chart, is amplified up, there will now be over, the bottom should be 16 billion or 17 billion fragments. Extra fragments of DNA, the evidence will show, could get into the sample in any number of ways. And that's one of the vices of this particular system and its reliability. From someone coughing on the evidence, from flecks of blood which may come from one sample and be passed on to another sample, from specks of blood that stick to a pair of tweezers, if the technician is using those, or scissors, from someone shedding dead skin cells onto the evidence, from dandruff, from any number of things. So the problem comes when one has more than one sample and the amplification gets into the billions. We still have the same problem as you look at that. These charts, we expect to have testimony from the experts to address these charts. And we hopefully use these today to make this process a little clearer to you of how the PCR is amplified up, try and get some results. And even when you get the results, as I indicated this morning, a match doesn't mean like a fingerprint. It means consistent with, generally. And there can be, when the contamination gets in there, then you can't tell one person's DNA from the other. And we can move on to the next chart. Now, in this case, to try and conclude our discussion of DNA so everybody can wake up again and be alive again, you've heard a lot about DNA, and you hear a lot about DNA evidence. The prosecution will undoubtedly present some of these technicians who come in from the crime lab, who perform the various tests And you'll recall that on this particular high-profile case, they designated as the officer in charge a Miss Mazzola, who was a trainee. This was only her third crime scene. She was supervised by a Mr. Fung, who was a supervisor that day. And we expect their technicians will come in, tell you what they did, the various tests they conducted, and the conclusions which they have drawn from the tests. We expect to present testimony, however, somewhat contrary, including some of the people I've told you about earlier. And we expect that the people we call will tell you, based upon their observation and their knowledge of the field, which of these test results are reliable and which ones aren't, given what the technicians will tell you that they did. Now, in summary, with regard to the DNA, we will look at each item, hopefully have testimony regarding each item, hopefully have some testimony regarding which items are reliable or not reliable, and then give you evidence by which you can make a final decision. You'll recall, I believe, that Ms. Clark in her opening statement said that blood consistent with Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman was found on the glove that this Detective Furman we talked about claims to have found behind Mr. Simpson's home. That glove will be undoubtedly, the evidence will show, one of the most hotly disputed items in this case. Where the glove was, how it got there, where it came from, be very important issues. In addition to that, there will be a major dispute in certain other areas. I think you'll hear a lot of testimony about the so-called blood found in the Bronco. You remember the Bronco timeline. I think you'll hear a lot of testimony about whether or not the prosecution's contention that blood consistent with, not their blood, but consistent with Goldman and Nicole found inside Nicole Brown Simpson, inside the Bronco, whether or not this finding is trustworthy. We expect the evidence will show and that the police technicians would use unreliable procedures in collecting this. They made fundamental errors in conducting these tests, and then they misinterpreted their own findings, as I've indicated to you earlier. That the stains that they think are consistent with Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson contain tiny amounts of DNA, so little can barely be detected. And this DNA could only be found using this super sensitive procedure we've talked about, where even a sneeze could contaminate it. So even if the test results were right, we think the evidence will show, the DNA could be from a tiny amount of contaminating DNA from the crime scene, from another person. Finally, in that connection, we think the evidence will show that the DNA results that supposedly put Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman in the Bronco are not like a fingerprint, and a match doesn't mean that. They detect characteristics in the DNA that millions of people have, not characteristics that are unique to one particular person. Now, let's talk about something other than DNA for a moment. When Mr. Simpson came back from Chicago, you think the evidence will be that he came home immediately. He came back voluntarily after hearing about his ex-wife's death. You have heard some indication about his demeanor on his way back, that he came home, that he was asked by the police to come downtown, that he went downtown, that, without giving you what the statement was, that he cooperated fully, and that he gave the police a statement, perhaps some 33 minutes, which statement is tape recorded, that the two detectives who interviewed him at the time were Detectives Lang and Van Adder. He answered all their questions. At the conclusion of that interview, they asked for a blood sample. Mr. Simpson was only too pleased or cooperative to go and give a blood sample at that time. And if I might step over a little closer, this next chart, and Mr. Douglas, what is this chart?
Number 205.
This chart hopefully will graphically illustrate what took place. Referring to number 205, we have Parker Center. This is the Los Angeles Police Department headquarters down at 150 North Los Angeles. This is the building in which Mr. Simpson gave this statement to the two lead detectives from robbery homicide. They questioned him and he answered their questions. Thereafter, and that's the building depicted, there's the little yellow circle depicted there. Thereafter, they asked Mr. Simpson to give some blood. The technician then drew some blood from his arm. We think, according to the testimony, it was approximately 8 milliliters of blood. The testimony was between 7.9 and 8.1, which I think is 8 milliliters of blood. Now, we think the evidence will show under normal police procedures, they've been following their own procedures. When the detectives had this blood in a vial, certainly Mr. Simpson's blood at that time, they would have taken it over about a 3-minute or very short drive and book it at a place called Piper Tech. With your evidence about where they book this kind of evidence, where the refrigerators are and that sort of thing. They book it to preserve it. You hear the importance of preserving that blood. We think the evidence in this case will show that the detectives didn't take the blood from Simpson at about 2:30 on June 13th, 1994. They didn't go this very short distance to Piper Tech and book it. For some reason, they came all the way, I guess this is some 20 miles or so, from downtown LA with the blood on their person in this vial, came all the way out here, this area called Brentwood, the home of O.J. Simpson, 360 North Rockingham Avenue. And we think the evidence will show Detective Van Adder, who had this blood on his person, instead of booking it in Piper Tech where it should have been, carried this blood around from 2:30 till perhaps 5:20 in the afternoon on June 13th, 1994. Went back to O.J. Simpson's home. And there, we expect there will be some testimony. That blood vial he'd been carrying around apparently in his pocket, he then turned over to Mr. Fung, who was the supervisor of this officer in charge, the trainee at the scene. And then you'll hear some interesting testimony about what happens to that blood. So the blood is supposed to be number 17, but it gets booked as number 18 at some point. Number 18 you're going to find is a pair of sneakers. That same afternoon at Rockingham, we think you'll hear testimony that Detective Van Adder's partner, Detective Lang, been at the LAPD some 25, 27 years, talks to Mr. Simpson after Mr. Simpson comes back home. And they ask him, what shoes were you wearing last night? Words to that effect. And they pick up a pair of Reebok tennis shoes. And I think you'll find that's consistent with what Cato Kalin had said he was wearing, I think, when he goes to McDonald's to get the hamburger. So they then take these tennis shoes. Tennis shoes are ultimately booked as number 18. But for a while, at least, the blood is also number 18. Detective Lang, I think, will testify that he takes these tennis shoes, he takes them home for the night. He doesn't go back downtown and book them or whatever. Takes them home and brings them back the next day, which would be the 14th. So there's this mislabeling, there's confusion as to what happens with this blood and who gets it. We know that the next morning, Fung has the blood downtown, and Colin Yamauchi, one of the technicians, takes 1 milliliter of blood out of this particular vial. So this blood, this is the strange saga of this blood and why it was carried out here. We expect the evidence will show exactly the events I've just testified to you, or just told you about in testimony. Mr. Douglas?
Next, Your Honor, is Exhibit 211.
Now, with regard to Exhibit 211, this exhibit seeks to demonstrate for you, as best we can, using the prosecution's records. All we can use is the records. These are their records. If this is wrong, maybe because the records are wrong. But the defendant's sample offered voluntarily. We've told you that. That's in Mr. Simpson's blood. I've already shared with you that you have 8 milliliters taken on June 13th. We know that the detective walks around with it for these 3 hours or so before the technician ever gets it. According to the records as we understand, so you start with the 8 milliliters. We know that on June 14th, we think there'll be testimony that Colin Yamauchi took from Fung 1 milliliter of Mr. Simpson's blood. we'll have to subtract that at some point. We know that 7 days later, Mr. Flaherty took 1.5 milliliters in a tube. It's a smaller tube, as indicated here. Ultimately, returned 8 milliliters from this tube. So we know there was 0.7 milliliters used out of the smaller tube that had been taken on the 21st. Then on June 25th, Colon Yamauchi again put some blood on some threads for some purpose, and he used only 0.05 milliliters at that point, according to our understanding of their evidence. Then on June 27th, Mr. Matheson, again, another one of the technicians, took 0.75 milliliters of Mr. Simpson's blood, all from the same tube. And finally, the defense at some point were given 1 milliliter of the blood. And we know that there's some blood left in the small tube, and we know that in a recent measurement in January, I think on or about January 4th of this year, there was 1.8 milliliters left in the tube, plus the 8 milliliters returned from the smaller tube. And if you subtract these particular figures, and I've done that, subtract the 1.0, the 0.7, the 0.05, the 0.75, the 1.0, you will have 3.50 milliliters of blood taken. To that, you have to add the 1.8 left, and the 0.8 that was used there are 2.60. So if you add the 2.60 to the 3.50, you will get 6.10 milliliters of blood. And so this chart, perhaps maybe it'll be explained to us during the trial, shows that if you started with 8.0 milliliters and you use 6.10 milliliters, there would be then 1.9 milliliters missing above the amount that's left, 1.90 missing. And one of the things we'll be looking at in this case is what happened to that missing blood, and where is it? Now, perhaps there are some records we haven't seen that will explain that. But those are the records as we understand it, that there would be 1.90 milliliters of missing blood in that connection. A bit more about this crime scene and what happened. We think you will see and hear from this trainee, Mazzola, and what she did at that scene, how she sought to collect these samples, Detective Fung's role at both Bundy and at both Rockingham. We think that you'll be able to then make a determination about what took place out there on that date. Now, one of the other key bits of evidence we expect in this case will be these socks that Ms. Clark talked to you about in her opening statement. Remember, she talked about the socks, and I think that with regard to the socks, I believe we have a timeline, and we also have a graphic with regard to the socks also. May we have the graphic and the number of the graphic? Okay. All right. What's the number?
Right here on the chart in Exhibit 212.
The graphic is D84.
D84? Thank you. You'll recall there was some testimony about this. I think there'll be testimony during the course of this case that this is the master bedroom in Mr. O.J. Simpson's home in Rockingham. There'll be testimony this place is usually meticulous and spotless. You'll note that the carpet is very, very light. And I think there'll be testimony the carpet is either white or very light throughout, going up the stairways and in the hallways and various other places. And you'll recall that in this picture, you'll notice that whatever this strap is on the bed is hanging down on the bed. I think there's another picture where that strap has been moved. And over in the center, and you'll see in this picture, the second picture, Mr. Harris, what is this? In this picture, you don't see the strap hanging down, so apparently it's been moved. You will see a view of these socks. These socks apparently bald, kind of part of them rolled up, and then on this carpet or rug that's at the foot of Mr. Simpson's bed and just in front of the fireplace. The only item you find there. And here's a close-up view of these socks, which were located there. And this now is June 13th, the afternoon hours, at the Rockingham residence. These socks are located. Now, the timeline, I think, is helpful to us as we consider and look at these socks. Again, these socks recovered on June 13th. Just talked about that. And they're examined on June 13th. There's no mention of blood on these socks on June 13th. We know that Michelle Kessler, basically the supervisor of the lab over there at LAPD, shows these socks, they can't really examine them, to two of our experts, Drs. Michael Baden and Dr. Barbara Wolf. They see the socks on June 24th. That's within 11 days of the socks having been taken back to the lab. It's June 24th. Around this same time, I think also in June, Miss Michelle Kessler, I think, makes some observations of these socks and at some point sees some fiber or something on the socks. So there's an opportunity, I believe the evidence will show, to look at these socks and have been able to observe them on more than one occasion. Then we think that on June 29th, 1994, the evidence will show that Kessler, Matheson, and Yamauchi do in fact inspect the socks. There's a third date in the saga of the socks. It's not until August 4th, 1994, that anybody in the LAPD lab sees a blood stain on these socks for the first time. Now, these are the same socks that you see up here. They're picked up on June 13th, been seen on the 13th, seen on the 24th, seen on the 29th, but yet it's August 4th before a blood stain is seen on these socks for the first time. And that's not all. We think the evidence will show that on or about September 22nd, 1994, there was, without testing any blame to anyone, a false leak to the press that Nicole Brown Simpson's DNA had been found on one of these socks. The problem with that false leak was that no DNA test had yet been performed. So they had predicted the results before the socks had ever been tested for DNA. They were still, in fact, at the LAPD lab, where they don't have the capacity to do this. Then the socks, after that leak, on the 22nd, I believe, and that leak was by a local Channel 4 reporter, who then reconfirmed that leak the next day about Nicole Brown Simpson's DNA on these socks. The socks then were not even sent out for DNA testing until September 26th, some 4 days later. Then, of course, lo and behold, on November 17, 1994, the lab reports they find DNA on the socks. Nicole Brown Simpson's DNA on the socks. Just as they had predicted in this false leak back September 22nd. And of course, these are the same socks where nobody saw any blood at all until August 4th. And that's not all with regard to these socks. You will hear that throughout, there are very, very small amounts of these nanograms, which you saw on the chart, on the evidence in this case. The nanograms found on these socks is more than 1,400 nanograms, which is as much as all the other blood tested in this entire case, just on these socks. So, we think this will be, the evidence will be, this will be a hotly contested item as to whether or not these socks were consciously, intentionally tampered with in an effort, in a rush to judgment, to get evidence on Mr. Simpson, where you have the results predicted before the socks are ever sent out to the lab. And the amount of this DNA being equal to the amount of all the rest of the blood found in this particular case. I think the evidence will show that in addition to this, you can see this area is very, very, very light around here. There's no blood found on this carpet or on that rug that's at the foot of his bed. There's no blood found on the light carpet, on the stairs, and the hallway floor on the way up. Because the court has indicated, I believe, that we'll have a jury view in this case, you'll be able to see for yourself, hopefully, at some time in the near future, this particular area. You can see for yourself exactly how it looks and what took place. I should point out that the LAPD did, in fact, do some serology on these socks at some time, but they did not have the capacity to do the DNA that was predicted. So we think this will be something that you will find of some great amount of interest, and it will be a major item litigated during the course of this particular hearing. I mentioned to you earlier, as we leave the socks and what took place, I wanted to briefly compare with you the conduct of O.J. Simpson with the conduct of the officers, the LAPD officers involved in this case for this general area of June 13th. Let's take, first of all, Mr. Simpson. You expect the evidence to show that Mr. Simpson's in Chicago on a prearranged, long-standing trip for Hertz to play golf. That he gets a call from Detective Phillips in the early morning hours. That his whole demeanor and everything changed, of course. That he comes back voluntarily. That when he gets back, he comes home. That he meets with the detectives. They ask him to come downtown. He goes downtown and he meets with the detectives without any counsel. That he talks with them. That he gives them blood. Does everything they ask of him. That he then comes back home that afternoon, June 13th, in the afternoon. Now, meanwhile, the detectives, we'll start with Detective Phillips, delayed, it's almost 10 hours before they get the coroner out there. And we've already talked about the ramifications of that and tried to establish this man's innocence. They then go from the Bundy crime scene to Rockingham. All four of them, as you know, then climb over the wall and they make these misrepresentations to the judge. So in their very first contact with the criminal justice system at 10:45 on June 13th, they don't tell the truth. The evidence will show. Because first of all, they know he's on a trip that was planned, and they say an unexpected trip. We've shown you those three items earlier. They don't tell the judge how they get over the wall or whatever. So these are the things they put in a declaration which you've previously seen already that day. They continue looking around, they amass and find evidence. We've talked already about how people at the scene, certainly at Bundy, are traipsing through the evidence and that sort of thing. They, later that day, after making contact with Mr. Simpson, are at his home. They go back downtown with him. They question him. They take his blood. Instead of taking his blood and booking it like they should have for their own procedures, they take that blood and come some 20 miles or so west, back to Rockingham, carry it around, seize his tennis shoes, don't book those until the next day, mislabel. The blood is to be 17, they label it 18. The tennis shoes or the sneakers are 18. And these are the experienced detectives in this case. When you look at this case, as the case progresses, we want you to characterize how they conducted themselves and how O.J. Simpson conducted himself in making a judgment in this case about whether or not the prosecution will ever prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. There will be a number of key witnesses in the case. Without getting into any of them, all witnesses are important. And I think all sides would agree that no side has a priority on the truth. All witnesses should be accorded, as the court has instructed you in looking at how you determine the truthfulness of a witness. You should do that. There are other miscellaneous points that I'd like to make at this point, with regard, one of which is with the 911 tape. The tape I have in mind now is the one from October 25th, 1993. I believe you heard testimony that one of the officers who came out at that particular time, and this is the time when many of you said during voir dire you'd heard this particular tape, when there's no physical injury or whatever, there's a door damage which is already damaged, which is damaged some more. Mr. Simpson agrees to fix that door. You'll hear what's on that tape with regard to what Mr. Simpson has to say and what Mrs. Simpson has to say about her intent and her thought. But I think what you'll find, the evidence will show that this argument, the entire argument on October 25th, 1993, was over picture frames of former lovers or lovers while they were away and separated from each other, not having been removed or taken out of the house as they were striving to get back together, as you know, during the latter part of 1993. In another area, in listening to the prosecution's opening statement, there was certainly a suggestion there may be some connection between the noises, these thumps on the wall, if you will, that were heard by Mr. Cato Kalin somewhere around 10:47 in the evening, and someone presumably climbing over the fence. His testimony, I think there's a fence back there near Cato's room, and accidentally dropping the glove where Detective Furman claims that he finds that glove, of course, later on in the morning. Keep in mind that there will be, we expect, testimony from Rosa Lopez about the fact that there are people and voices over in the Simpson compound, 12 o'clock on till about 3 o'clock, that she hears. It's not O.J. Simpson's voice out there. She hears people talking. She can't go to sleep, she says. We think the evidence will show that this walkway, which is very, very narrow, is very, very near where she lives, kind of in her housekeeper quarters in the house right next door. We expect the evidence to be that the area where Detective Furman claims that he found this particular glove is an area that has a number of cobwebs and things back there, which one might infer that people hadn't been walking back there, hadn't been back there for a while. I think the evidence will also show that on that side of Mr. Simpson's home, Mr. Simpson had wanted to come home and hide himself from anybody outside, a limousine driver. There are at least 2 entrances to his house on that side. There's one door the evidence will show that goes into a laundry room, and of course there's a door into the garage, all on this side of the house. I make these statements because I think this is what the evidence will show in response to what the prosecution has indicated. I think you'll also find that there will be testimony. There is a great amount of very thick shrubbery at the top of that fence that separates the property where Ms. Lopez lives, where Mr. Simpson lives on that date. And I think you'll hear testimony as to whether or not any of those twigs, leaves, or any of those items were ever disturbed or appeared to be disturbed, as though anybody had climbed over that fence. Now, we're going to turn our attention to something I alluded to the last time. We call it the timeline. One of the things that we expect to show during the course of this trial is not only did Mr. Simpson not commit these brutal murders, but he did not, would not, could not, the time frame that committed these particular killings under the witnesses that both sides know about and we understand. What we have is a timeline with a chart and a timeline with the graphics, which we'd like to call to your attention now. So what's the number of that?
That is D87.
D87? And D87, so that you're clear, this is the Simpson compound. This is the home on Rockingham that you've heard a lot about. This street over here is the... Can I get that back? Thank you, Mr. Harris, sir. This street over here is the Ashford Street, where ultimately Allen Park will come. This street over here is the Rockingham gate, where the Bronco will be parked. There's a gate right here, and the Bronco was parked right there. Remember, we indicated there'll be testimony about when the Bronco comes out, how it's a sharp turn right to that location. And over here, there'll be testimony that Cato Kalin's vehicle is parked. And in some of the subsequent photographs, I believe we'll see that his vehicle is parked here on Ashford also. Thank you, Mr. Harris.
D108A.
And this is the Bundy residence of Nicole Brown Simpson, and I believe that 875 Bundy is right there. This is the walkway that Detective Phillips talked about, right up in that way. A lot of shrubbery, and there's a gate there. The testimony was, you recall, or his statement was, you can see the bodies from the street, and the gate was open. I think you saw some pictures when the prosecutors were doing their opening statement. This is Bundy, and Bundy in this area is a street that traverses north and south. North being this way, south being that way, west being here at the top, as I understand it. And this is the area here where these bodies were found. This is Nicole Brown Simpson's residence. It's the residence that she had purchased. You recall, with the funds that she'd gotten from the money that Mr. Simpson had given before he married, and then some additional funds that he'd given her. She had moved there voluntarily. And you heard the approximate distance between the two. Why don't you hold on? Mr. Douglas, why don't you put yours up? Now, before we go into the timeline, we'll talk more about this, and you'll hear more about this when we discuss so-called alibi testimony. One of the things that I expect the evidence to show in this case is that Mr. Simpson does, in fact, have an alibi for his whereabouts on that particular night during the critical time. You'll recall that the prosecutors in their opening statement talked about the period of time between 9:45 and about 11. So our evidence here this afternoon will track that same period of time, 9:45 p.m. till about 11 o'clock p.m. And you'll recall the testimony that you've heard so far, that Ms. Nicole Brown Simpson spoke to her mother and an individual at the Mezzaluna restaurant, certainly in the area of 9:42 or thereabouts, had 2 phone calls in that period of time. So it's reasonable to assume that she certainly was alive at that particular point in time. So that's probably a very good starting point. What you have on the board, and this number, Mr. Douglas, what's his number again?
213.
All right, this is 213. This is a view, a side-by-side view of each of these residences side by side. What we're going to do is we're going to start at 9:45, and in each instance for Rockingham and for Bundy, tell you what we expect the evidence to show of the various parties and where they were. Let's take the graphic on the board. And what's that number, Mr. Harris?
D107.
Thank you. At 9:45, at the Rockingham residence, Mr. Simpson's, you'll see in this thing, we think the evidence is going to show that Cato Kalin is in his quarters, Mr. O.J. Simpson's in his quarters, and to the right here is Rosa Lopez, and you'll see this area. Let me just use this as an example. Hold up there, Mr. Harris. I think the evidence will show that the side of the house, Rosa Lopez lives right over in this part here, but there's this side of the house, a little walkway that goes right down the side of the house, back this way. That's where Detective Furman claims he found the glove in this very, very small area. It leads back out here somewhere. So 9:45 at the Rockingham residence, you see the parties who are there. Mr. Douglas has charted that on the chart here. You can see it in both places. Mr. Harris, the next one.
D109.
All right, at 9:45 or thereabouts at Bundy, you'll recall this is the residence right there on Bundy, and we know from expect the testimony to be that Mr. Nicole Brown Simpson had a phone conversation with her mother and with somebody at the Mezzaluna restaurant about having the glasses which the party had left at Mezzaluna. We expect she's still very much alive at that particular time. Mr. Harris?
D110.
We're taking this in 5-minute intervals, and obviously these intervals are this because you're doing it within 5 minutes. It's not exact, but it's as close as we can approximate based upon the evidence as we now understand it. At 9:50, parties in their same relative positions, Rosa Lopez, Mr. Simpson, Mr. Cato Kalin still in the side his residence. 9:50,
111.
number 111, same situation with regard to Bundy.
D112.
9:55. Again, now keep in mind that the testimony will be that Rosa Lopez at about 8:15, between 8:15 and 8:30, has come out. She's seen this Bronco parked there. She's walked her dog somewhere back in this area over here that I'm indicating with the light, and she sees the Bronco kind of parked somewhat askew. And 9:55, this is the relative positions that we think the evidence will show the parties at Rockingham at that time.
D113.
9:55, nothing else has changed at the Bundy scene at that point. Mr. Harris?
D114.
At 10 o'clock. This is at Rockingham, and at 10 o'clock, for your attention, I think you'll find there'll be testimony that the Bentley, of course, that Mr. Simpson and Mr. Cato Kalin had gone to get the McDonald's, the hamburgers in, parked in the yard there. That Cato Kalin is taking his food back to his room to eat. That they'd gone somewhere around 9 o'clock They got back somewhere around 9:37 to 9:40, somewhere in that area. Bentley was parked. Mr. Simpson had eaten his hamburger. Rosa Lopez remains at the same place. We've drawn in, based upon what we expect the testimony to be, the car on the Ashford side here, the Cato Kalin's car. It's all in black there. And you see, of course, the Bronco. That's the 10 o'clock scene, as we expect the evidence to show, at Rockingham.
D115.
Now at Bundy, at 10 o'clock, we expect there will be testimony that a man named Tom Lang, same name as the detective in this case, but not the detective, a witness, we think will testify that he's out, as so many people in this neighborhood do, walking his dog down here. There's a street down here called Dorothy Street. It's this dog, and he's out walking the dog, and that he makes a statement to the police, which he tells the police that he sees a lady who fits the description of Nicole Brown Simpson wearing something, some kind of a black dress. The detective who takes the statement down, the evidence will show, miswrites it and puts it like a white flowing dress. But he tells him black dress, I think the evidence will show. That he sees from this location down here, he sees this lady whom he believes is Nicole Brown Simpson, either touching or in some way embracing someone at a car parked at this curb, right about in this area here. That he is south of their location, and he sees a gentleman at the car, and he sees Mr. Nicole Brown Simpson. What he also sees, he sees a man he describes as a Hispanic gentleman standing on the sidewalk beyond where Mr. Nicole Brown Simpson and this gentleman are, and he is standing with his fist clutched, as I'm indicating for the record, staring down at Mr. Lang. And he thinks this man may be angry with him because his dog is loose or whatever. So that's Mr. Lang, and that's 10 o'clock at that, and this is the residence here, that's 10 o'clock at the Bundy Street location, forgive me. And if Mr. Lang, of course, is correct, and Nicole Brown Simpson is still alive, of course, at that point. At 10:05, at the Rockingham residence, Mr. Simpson has come outside the house. Mr. Simpson, I think the evidence will show at some point, made a telephone call somewhere between 10 and 10:05 to his then girlfriend, Paula Barbieri, on a portable phone that he'd had in this Bronco. There was a phone call. He was unable to hook up with her, but he did, in fact, make this phone call. I think there'll be records of whatever that affects. So at 10:05, that's the situation there, with Cato Kalin still being in his room and Rosa Lopez still being at her location.
D116.
10:05, we still have the same situation at the Bundy location. We have Tom Lang, still at his same approximate location, as we described. After making the phone call at the Rockingham location, we now have Mr. Simpson back inside. Mr. Simpson very often will swing golf clubs, which he keeps all over the place, in Bentley, in the garage or whatever, I think the evidence will be, and that he sometimes will chip. For you, those of you who are golfers, he'll chip or swing his 4-wood or 3-wood, generally over in this direction over here, where there's some sand where the kids can play and that sort of thing. So during this period of time, Mr. Simpson at some point swings his golf clubs or whatever, and at this point and later chips, so he's out in this yard area after having made the call.
That was D118, D119.
10:10, not much happening at Bundy that we can tell.
D120.
All right, after Mr. Simpson has done that and been outside, make his phone call, I think then you'll find the relative positions of the parties. Simpson back inside the residence. The evidence will be he's going to Chicago. At some point he has to pack, get ready. Cato Kalin's in his room. And Rosa Lopez still at her location at that point, although she's just about to leave.
D121.
All right, same situation at 10:15 at the Bundy location.
D122.
At this location at about 10:15 to 10:20, Rosa Lopez then comes outside of her location to walk her dog again. And she comes out in this general area to the right here on Rockingham. We expect the testimony to be that Rosa Lopez sees the Bronco still parked the same configuration, the same location, just like she had seen it between 8:15 and 8:30. She sees it between 10:15, 10:20, the same location. And we think she'll also testify she saw this same Bronco parked in the same manner, same location, same configuration the next morning after she had talked with Detective Furman. And that's Rosa Lopez at 10:20, thereabouts, at Rockingham.
D-123.
At 10:20, contrary to what you've been told, I think, by the evidence by the prosecution that they can determine death by the plaintiff will of a dog, we have some live witnesses, Ellen Aronson and Dan Mandel. It's the two that I alluded to earlier who've been apparently on this date to Metzaluna, and they're walking home. They're walking down Bundy from north to south at about 10:20. They walk north to south in this location as I've indicated here. Thank you, Mr. Harris.
D-124.
At the other location at about 10:25, we expect that Rosa Lopez at the Rockingham is certainly going back inside the residence now, having walked the dog. Mr. Simpson inside the residence, Cato Kayla inside the residence, and we have now for the first time the limousine driver, Alan Park, who comes up. And it's interesting if can you back that up a minute, Mr. Harris? Interesting at the 10:25 location, and you recall because I read you the testimony of Alan Park at both the preliminary hearing and the grand jury that he didn't see or didn't look to see any other cars. Ms. Cato Kalin's car was there. He didn't look to see his Bronco was down there. And you will hear evidence, I'm sure, with regard to whether or not, what about the streets at that time of night, 10:25, 10:30 on a Sunday in Brentwood? What might you expect to hear? Were there lights on? What would be observable at that location? I believe hopefully we'll be able to go out to these scenes at night also. So we have Cato Kalin's car, Alan Park's limousine, and the relative positions of the other parties. We'll go now back to Bundy.
D-125.
Now by this time, according to what I expect the testimony to be, Ellen Aronson and Dan Mandel have continued walking south on Bundy, and now they are right in front of the residence there at Bundy. Now, the importance of this, we think the evidence will show, that they walk there this very short distance, right to their right, if the crimes had occurred, would be these bodies, with the gate open, with blood flowing down. If you remember when I read this morning from Phillips's transcript, when he was talking to the coroner about the need to come out there, these bodies are right there. They can be seen from the sidewalk or from the street. So these people are in a rather unique position. I believe that their testimony will be they saw no bodies, they saw no gate open at that point. It was approximately 10:25 when they're walking at this particular location. So they become, as with all witnesses, very important. They become particularly important when the prosecution tries to present a theory that these killings had occurred at 10:15.
D-126.
Back at 10:30, we have Rosa Lopez go back to her house. Everybody else in their same positions. The Park is still out with the limousine. In fact, Park has at some point gotten outside the vehicle. If the testimony will be, and he's somewhere out here on the Ashford side of the residence.
D-127.
10:30, I think we now have Robert Heidstra, who is in this alley. I described for you before an alley that runs parallel to Bundy, and this will be measured for the distance between this alley and Bundy there. But he also is out walking his dog on this Sunday evening. He's walking in this direction, again apparently from north to south. And it's about 10:30 that he first appears.
D-128.
10:35, the situation is still pretty much the same at this point. The limousine driver is early. The roles of the various people appear approximately the same, 10:35.
D-129.
10:35. Now you'll recall that Ellen Aronson and Dan Mandel have walked past this location at about 10:25. They don't see any bodies or gates or any blood. Now this man, Robert Heidstra, is in this alleyway. I believe the testimony will be that at 10:35 or thereabouts, he hears some unusual things. He hears the sound hey, hey, hey. He hears, I believe you'll hear, a gate clanging or closing. There will be testimony there are gates back this way at the Nicole Brown Simpson residence, in addition to one in the front. That he hears the sound of men arguing. I believe is what the testimony will be. So from this location, he can hear this. He hears this going on. He hears that to be at about 10:35 p.m. That's at the Bundy location. He's in the alleyway, and he's approximately parallel to the Bundy location, except he's in the alleyway off of Bundy. It's at 10:35.
D130.
We know that according to the testimony of Mr. Park, at some point, about 10:40 or thereabouts, he pulls the limousine around. He's been trying to get contact with someone. He pulls around up to the Rockingham gate, which is on this side, as opposed to the Ashford gate, which is on this side, and that he apparently then goes back. You know, having heard his testimony read at both the preliminary hearing and the grand jury, not looking for and cannot tell us either way whether the Bronco is there or not. He goes back to this location, and that's about 10:40 or thereabouts, the Rockingham.
D131.
All right, at 10:40, we have Mr. Heistra still in this alleyway, in this area. This is approximately the time at 10:40 p.m., June 13th, that he hears this confrontation, supposedly with these men's voices, the sounds, etc., and the distance that he's away.
D132.
All right, at 10:45, there'll be testimony, I believe, that Allen Park is up to the gate at this point, that you see the location of the other parties, their location. He's closer to the gate with the car right at the gate. You see the parties of the position of the other parties at that time. He's moved his car back from down at the Ashford gate back around. It's 10:45 or thereabouts.
D133.
10:45. This is the journey of Mr. Heistra as he's continued down this alleyway. See where he's gotten now as he's walking the dogs. And he's still walking parallel to the residence, having made the observations that I've shared with you earlier.
D134.
10:50 or thereabouts. Mr. Simpson, the evidence would show, he's come outside of his residence. He's gone over to the Bentley at that point. Look inside the Bentley, and this location here, it's a white car, a white indication there. That's supposedly Bentley at that location. Simpson's outside the residence. Park is over at the gate. Lopez is back in her residence. Cato Kalin is still somewhere back in his quarters, apparently, at that point.
D135.
10:50 now at the Bundy address. There are no witnesses at this particular point.
D136.
Now, 10:55. We now have Mr. Simpson having been or done whatever he's doing in the area of the Bentley, going back over toward his house, to get his luggage and come down to get ready to leave. You have Cato Kalin coming out, presumably because he's heard whatever noises. He's now outside of the location. Allen Park is still over here. There's some testimony there'll be some golf clubs or whatever out here in this area of the yard in this area here. All at Rockingham. This is approximately 10:55, just before 11.
D137.
The scene remains pretty much the same. Robert Heistra is now out of the scene here at Bundy.
D138.
11 o'clock, Allen Park is let in. Their testimony, I think, will be that they start to load the limousine up, which is now inside here. Cato Kalin is having conversations with O.J. Simpson about noise that he's heard. He's trying to get a flashlight. He's trying to tell Mr. Simpson about what he thinks he's heard. Mr. Simpson is rushing around at this point. At some point, he goes back out. He goes to the Bronco at some point, comes back in, gets his luggage, and brings his luggage down, the number of pieces of luggage, which you'll hear about. And all of these people in and around the 11 o'clock and thereabouts frame are in this particular area here, as depicted on this exhibit at Rockingham. Mr. Harris?
D139.
Situation remains the same at Bundy. And so at Bundy, there are no other witnesses at this point. Mr. Harris, will you go back to Rockingham at 11 o'clock? Cato Kalin's car remains in the same place. The limousine is now closer in the Ashford Gate. Bentley's still where it is. The Bronco's still where it is. Ms. Lopez is in her residence. Kaylin, Mr. Simpson, at or around this area with Mr. Park. As I've indicated, this is the time that they're preparing to go on this pre-scheduled trip to the airport to go to Chicago. Around this time or thereabouts, Mr. Simpson's come out and gone out to the Bronco, and then he comes back in also at that point. I've taken this from 9:45 until 11 o'clock because that's the time the prosecutor referred to and talked to, and I think it probably is the very appropriate time for us to look at. In discussing this particular timeline, I tried to demonstrate for you the witnesses that we expect will be called, what they have to say about this particular period of time. In listening to the prosecution's opening statement, they claim that Mr. Simpson left the Rockingham location, traveled to Bundy, killed 2 people with 1 knife, hid the bloody clothes, and returned to Rockingham. He did all this at about 10:15 or 10:15 and got back there at 10:25 or 10:30 or something of that nature. In a short period of time, that's what their theory was. We think that they have further, based upon their opening statement, committed themselves to a theory that in traveling to and from Bundy, Mr. Simpson had used this Bronco that you've heard so much about. So therefore, wherever that Bronco was that night, then according to their theory, that's where Mr. Simpson was that particular evening. What we tried to demonstrate for you in the evidence, we think will show, there's not that window of opportunity. There's not the time in which they can prove that Mr. Simpson committed these horrible crimes. They don't have the time, the opportunity, nor the motive to establish this. We think the evidence will show that he did not, could not, and would not committed these particular crimes. Now, in the course of this trial, you will hear some testimony regarding domestic discord, domestic violence, if you will, about what happened. I touched upon that briefly the other day. Without belaboring the point, and as you hear this testimony, I ask you, as with all of the evidence, to keep an open mind, to remember that the incident, January 1st, 1989, was the assaultive incident that Mr. Simpson took blame for, wrote letters of apology. And you recall the testimony we expect to be she was never struck after that in any physical sense, and that, in fact, he made an agreement regarding the prenuptial agreement, that if there was any physical touching, the prenuptial agreement would be voidable at any rate. That was never done. And we expect to show that with regard to this entire domestic discord evidence, that there will be, and I ask you to bear in mind, in many instances where there are more than one person present, please keep an open mind until you've heard the other people who are also present at these incidents, so you can make a determination of whether this has any bearing at all. Because if you follow the evidence, and if you believe that Mr. Simpson could not have done this, that this timeline is such that there's no time for him to do it, no indication that he could have done this, that the Bronco was still there, whatever, then the character evidence would mean absolutely nothing. Because how could you then predict that someone who gets into a fight with his wife in 1989 will then kill her in 1994? One area that I did not cover earlier is the searching done in this case. They've searched everywhere in this case for weapons and or clothes, and I think the evidence will be that they searched even in Chicago, in the fields, in the wooded areas in Chicago, all up and down Rockingham and Bundy and every place they possibly could. They worked very hard on this case because in their rush to judgment, they fixed on this one individual, and that's what they focused on, and we think the evidence will show that that's exactly what they did. Ms. Clark in her opening statement said that Mr. Simpson's time was unaccounted for, quote her, from 9:45 till 11. I think you'll find when you hear the evidence that he spoke to the police. This time is not unaccounted for. The time will be accounted for. May I conclude, Your Honor?
Now, I want you to approach the bench with the report, please.
Now, I think when we stopped, I was addressing the issue that we think the evidence will show that Mr. Simpson's time will be accounted for and not unaccounted during this particular period of 9:45 to 11 o'clock. In looking at my remarks the last time I spoke to you, I noticed that I misspoke when I said at one point that Dr. Carrie Mullis had won, I think I said, the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think I must have had Dr. Martin Luther King on the mind when I talked about him. He won the Nobel Prize for chemistry. I'm going to clear that up. When I was addressing you about the prosecution's theory a few moments ago in this case, I recall that Ms. Clark had indicated that the time of death was 10:15 based upon the wail of the dog. As to the time she alleges that Mr. Simpson got back to the premises, that'll be up to her to prove, and I suppose that I shouldn't speculate with regard to that. Now, I'd like now for Mr. Douglas to bring some charts up that relate to certain jury instructions, which I think would be very appropriate for you to have in mind, as with all of the jury instructions that the court has given you with regard to the evidence in this case and how you're going to go about your task of rendering a decision now that you have an overview of this evidence. We'll have 4 charts that I'd like to step down.
First, Your Honor, Exhibit 214.
Now this chart is 2.20, which is the CalJIC, the jury instruction. I think you've already heard it. And the reason I wanted to point this out to you again is that as in this case, and in all criminal cases, this is kind of a guide for you to look at the witnesses who get on the witness stand, to help you in determining whether or not you find that particular witness to be credible or believable, if you will. And they set out certain things that you might look at. And, look at things like the ability of the witness to remember or to communicate any matter about which the witness has testified, character and quality of the testimony of that particular witness, the demeanor, how that witness acts on the stand, and the manner of that testimony, the existence or non-existence of a bias. Does the witness have any interest or bias in this particular case you're looking at? So the attitude of the witness toward this action will be things that you'll look at. And the court has read this to you in the character of the witness for honesty or truthfulness, or any statement previously made or whatever. These are the things that I would ask you to use with regard really to all witnesses called by the prosecution or the defense. Remember, the no side has a claim to the truth in this case as we go about this search for truth people have been talking about. The next jury instruction, and that is number, Mr. Douglas, number, we will get the number, Your Honor.
Looks like 215.
Okay, okay. Like that, huh? Number 215. And number 215 is the so-called alibi instruction. And you'll recall that I asked you in voir dire a long time ago that you would not put any bad connotation on the term alibi if that's what the law calls it. That no matter who is charged with a particular offense, if you were someplace else, you produce evidence that you were someplace else, the law calls that an alibi. And essentially this instruction says that the defendant in this case actually will be introducing or expects to introduce evidence for the purpose of showing that he was not present at the time and place of the commission of the alleged crimes in this case for which he's here on trial. That if after consideration of all the evidence you have a reasonable doubt that the defendant was present at the time the crime was committed, you must find him not guilty. Now again, this instruction is important like all the rest, but the alibi instruction, if you establish the alibi to your satisfaction, be entitled to an acquittal under those circumstances. I'd ask you to think about that through the coming months as you listen to this evidence.
Exhibit 216.
Mr. Douglas? You recall all of the examples we used during voir dire again about direct and circumstantial evidence. Well, in the final analysis, this is a case that will rest primarily on circumstantial evidence, and you know what that evidence is. And there's a jury instruction that applies to that. It's extremely appropriate. And I think I applaud Judge Ito for having given you this instruction early on, because I think it's very, very important for you to be aware of this as you consider this evidence, especially circumstantial evidence, and how it will be applied at the very end of this particular case. This is part of that instruction, and the relevant portions would be as follows: that a finding of guilt as to any crime may not be based on circumstantial evidence, unless the proof circumstances are not only one, consistent with the theory that the defendant is guilty of the crime, but cannot be reconciled with any other rational conclusion. Further, each fact which is essential to complete a set of circumstances necessary to establish the defendant's guilt must be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, before an inference essential to establish guilt may be found to have been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, each fact or circumstance upon which such inference necessarily rests must be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Also, if the circumstantial evidence as to any particular count, we have two counts here, susceptible to two reasonable interpretations, one of which points to the defendant's guilt and the other to his innocence, you must adopt that interpretation which points to the defendant's innocence and reject that interpretation which points to his guilt. So after you listen to this evidence, as we think the evidence will show, and you have a belief that Mr. Simpson did not go back over to that location, didn't go to the location, that he was never, that his Bronco never left the premises that night based upon.
Your Honor, this is all argument.
Well, let me phrase it a different way. If she's
Please.
not right, Your Honor.
And the
Object-
adoption of the instruction is not read in the verdict.
I'm going to get to it. If after you've heard all the evidence, and you know what circumstantial evidence is, you will then be in a position to make a judgment as to whether it applies at this particular point. Without arguing what it is now, we'll have a chance to argue at a later time. But the point that I wanted to make at this point is for you to understand what this instruction would be as the court has. And lastly, as Ms. Clark points out, if on the other hand, one interpretation of such evidence appears to you to be reasonable and the other interpretation to be unreasonable, you must accept the reasonable interpretation and reject the unreasonable. It seems reasonable, doesn't it? But the point is that you, no one else, will be the sole and exclusive judges of the facts and the weight of evidence. That's the determination that you must make. And no one can tell you what to make in that regard. And each of you in voir dire promised to give us your individual opinion in doing that. And the last jury instruction
Exhibit 217, Your Honor.
is the so-called presumption of innocence, reasonable doubt, and burden of proof instruction. It's the last instruction I want to leave with you today. A defendant in a criminal action is presumed to be innocent until the contrary is proved. In the case of a reasonable doubt, whether his guilt is satisfactorily shown, he is entitled to a verdict of not guilty. This presumption, of course, as you know, places upon the people the burden of proving him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt has been defined as follows. It's not a mere possible imaginary doubt, because everything relating to human affairs, depending upon that everything relating to human affairs is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. It is that state of the case where after the entire comparison and consideration of all the evidence leaves the minds of the jurors, in that condition that they cannot say, they feel an abiding conviction of the truth of the charge. Now that's what reasonable doubt is in this case, in every case. And I wanted to make sure that you again are aware of that as you listen to this case. This is a murder case with two charges, two counts. This is not a domestic violence case. Now, as we conclude, and finally, as I promised you today, I believe the evidence will show that evidence and testimony that a short time before Mr. Simpson went to Chicago on Sunday evening, June 12th, I think on or about June 2nd, his secretary, at his request, ordered this Star 69 feature at his request on his phone. And we expect there'll be additional testimony about that and as to why that was. In summary, as you then look at all the evidence in this case, we expect the evidence will show that O.J. Simpson, as you see him there, is not a perfect human being. He, like all of us, has made mistakes. Of course, we know there's only one perfect person who ever walked the earth. We think the evidence will show he's not guilty of these horrible crimes, that he has been blessed bountifully by God, and he shared his largesse and blessings with many, many people. That in this instance, the prosecutor's theory that there was only one murderer is just theory. We expect to introduce evidence to show there was more than one killer, and that the prosecutor's theory will be overcome by the facts which we present. We also expect that the evidence to show that the reason the prosecution maintains there's only one killer is that Mr. Simpson, whom they want to portray as a stalker, and stalkers don't come in pairs. It can only be one person under that scenario. That ex-husbands who are stalkers don't come in pairs, and that's why they're wedded to this one murderer theory, even contrary to what their own coroner may very well indicate. I've shared with you also the fact of Mr. Goldman's journey that evening and when he checked out and went home and changed clothes and everything, so I will not belabor that. We expect there'll be evidence about how you get into 875 South Bundy when one comes up and rings the bell or whatever, and how you get in from the house or whether that's possible, whether somebody has to let you in or how you get in the particular residence. I've already told you we expect there will be evidence of the size of this area, and I think Ms. Clark has indicated, and I think the evidence will show, it's a very, very small area given the circumstances. We will show that the police who came over to Bundy, who you will see walking through that scene, went in that house and didn't take one picture. They went in the house, that they found candles burning and various other things, that the investigation inside that house was shoddy and scarce, if at all, under the circumstances. And so in this case, as with many cases, you'll recall that we talked to you a lot about truth and your common sense. During voir dire, I think all of us told you that we wanted you to use your collective common sense. And don't leave it outside in the hallway, to bring it in and apply it to the facts of this particular case. In applying that common sense, as I indicated to you, you'll look and you'll be able to see this small area. You'll see the fight that Mr. Goldman put up. You see the injuries that he sustained. You hear the testimony about the amount of blood to be expected on the perpetrator. You've seen Mr. Simpson's body, the lack of scratches thereon. You'll see, and your common sense will address, based upon the evidence, the issue of whether one person could kill two people under these circumstances without hearing screaming and a lot of running and all sort of things. We expect, hopefully, that the evidence presented by the defense will help you provide some answers to these common sense questions. Expect also that you'll hear from a witness by the name of Paula Barbieri. I think she's, both sides are aware of it, and will testify about her relationship with Mr. O.J. Simpson. Specifically, as I mentioned earlier, between the period May of 1992 and May of 1993, and May of 1994 to the present. This case really boils down to a whodunit. So this case is about. It's not about domestic violence or whatever. It's about who killed these two people in these particular horrible crimes. The prosecution will probably start off with the domestic discord evidence. And that, with all the evidence, I ask you to keep an open mind. You know the circumstances. You know there are generally two sides to every situation. We cannot call our witnesses till we get our time in the part of the case where it's our time to put the witnesses on. That's why I've spent so much time in this opening statement, to try to detail for you what we expect the evidence to be and what we expect to show. You understand that the fact that someone has an altercation with one's wife in 1989 is not capable of being predicted whether that person will kill her, or be involved in any other fights, or whatever.
Sustain.
And so I started off by indicating to you that I thought this case would be a case where we would establish this was a rush to judgment by the prosecution, and they had theories and speculation. We would have the facts.
I assume these are the concluding remarks.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you. They would have theories and speculation, and we would have the facts. That I was trying to conclude what I was saying when she interrupted me here. In this instance, in this case, both sides are interested in this search for truth. That's what a trial really is. It's a journey for truth, for you to determine the true facts of what happened on June 12, 1994. We spent a great amount of time in selecting each of you for this task, because we knew it would be a very significant task. And in truth, I'm always reminded of something that James Russell Lowell said. The truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and beyond the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. And in this case, God knows what happened on June 12th.
Objection, Your Honor.
It's argument, all of it.
This is not argument, Your
It's a
Honor.
closing comment. Thank you, counsel.
Thank you. God knows what happened on June 12th, 1994. And we hope that after you've heard all the evidence in this case, you can make a rational decision, and you too will know what happened. And you will know that O.J. Simpson,
Objection, Your Honor.
He can say that that's what he intends to prove, counsel. He can say that.
Thank you, Your Honor. And you will know that the evidence will show that O.J. Simpson, that man pictured over there on June 12th, did not kill his wife, did not kill Ron Goldman. And he is entitled to an acquittal. Thank you very much for your attention. It's maybe the longest opening statement in the history of this building. But I appreciate your patience and the fact that you took the time to listen. Thank you.
All right, thank you, counsel. Deputy McNair, we're going to take a break. Let me see counsel without the reporter before we do that, though. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're at that part of the trial where we will now, this afternoon, start the presentation of the witnesses and evidence to you. As I mentioned to you, before we actually started the presentation of the witnesses, we needed to do a little moving around of materials and things here in the courtroom. We're going to do that, and I expect to start with the witnesses in about half an hour. All right, so I'm going to excuse you to go back up to the lounge. Please remember my admonition to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves, form any opinions. Don't talk to anybody about it. Let anybody talk to you. And we'll see you back here in about 30 minutes. All right?